Okay, I'm going to paraphrase this next question, but it had to do with this. A parent was asking, how do you handle the situation on mental health meds from children all the way up to adults? Because now it's a common thing where kids are going into school and they say they cannot deal with the situation, their anxiety and stuff, unless they're on meds. And when you're talking about all the way up to adults, they were asking, as a Christian, how does that all work? And then the second part to that question was, if you have somebody that has a mental health disorder in your home, how do you deal with that? They didn't say if they were a Christian or not, but we know how the world handles it. Maybe they're on medications, maybe they're not. Mental health is obviously something that's blowing up. As a Christian, how do you handle with someone in your family dealing with those issues?
Well, first off, the Bible talks about the fact that God changes people's hearts. And everybody has a mental health issue before they come to Christ. It's like everybody's messed up. And so it's one of those things that you need to keep in mind. I was just watching some a mental health professional. She is a psychiatrist over in England, and actually she's I believe she's connected with Oxford over in England, and she's written a couple of books on the whole issue of SSRIs, the drugs that they pass out for depression and that kind of thing. And one of the points that she made and that she's been making in the field stridently is that what the mental health professionals have been saying about these drugs is not actually something that can be scientifically backed up. So basically, one of the points that she's been making is that all the way up until the 60s, when people were given drugs, they were given tranquilizers, or they were given drugs that would kind of pep them up. Okay, and so it was one way or the other. You were either calming somebody down, or you were giving them a drug that would help them to get past their lethargy. Okay, and that's how these things were sold, and that's how they were promoted. And so they were just a drug that would help you with attitude and that kind of stuff. Beginning in the 80s, though, the pharmaceutical companies began changing that whole tactic and talking about chemical imbalances. Mm-hmm. And then it became the whole idea that I have a chemical imbalance. I'm missing certain types of chemicals in my brain. This drug will increase those chemicals, and that helps me out. And here's the major problem that she has brought up about this whole thing. Those drugs work exactly the same on everybody who takes them. And so whether I have a chemical imbalance or not, if I take an antidepressant, it's going to have the same effects on me that it would on somebody who's depressed. It has the same physical effects, it has the same mental effects, and what you're actually doing is giving them a drug that makes them not care about what's going on around them. So it doesn't matter who it is. And that is not an indication that the person has a chemical imbalance. And so that's one of the points that she's been making. And another point that she's been making that's really been interesting is the fact that a lot of these problems are better solved by behavior modification, which means you change your lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And that many of these problems are actually changed by having friends. And so you have that whole thing. So there is this turnaround in the mental health arena where many people are beginning to look at this whole thing with chemical imbalances and that kind of stuff. First off, you can't tell if somebody has a chemical imbalance unless you take their brain apart. You have to cut into their head to find out if a person has a chemical imbalance. Going through a list of questions on a piece of paper, an oral exam, does not tell you that you have a chemical imbalance. It tells you that you have problems in your life, not a chemical imbalance. And again, it's something to keep in mind when you're looking at this stuff. I've dealt with people for a long time, been doing counseling for a long time, and from my estimation, there are way too many people on antidepressants, and they're way too dependent on this stuff. When you go to school, when you start talking about school, you can have situations where you'll have teachers who are dealing usually with little boys. And they're being told that there's a lot of ADHD going around. And again, when you start talking to mental health professionals that are reasonable about this stuff, the incidence of ADHD is nowhere near the amount of people that are being prescribed ADHD medications. And so basically what's happening is we've got this culture where people are passing out these drugs without really going through and figuring out what the issues are and what could be taken care of. I'm convinced, we have a school, and this is one of the things that I've talked to my wife about. She's the principal there, and the school teachers about. We have a school, everybody in that building are women, as far as the ones who are running the school. And schools generally are not set up for little boys. Telling a little boy to sit still, when he's in third grade, for 50 minutes at a time, and he only gets to get up every 3 hours and do a 10-minute recess, and thinking that things are going to go well is not reasonable.
Right.
That is not how little boys work. Little girls can work that way, and not all of them. I know I'm painting with a broad brush, but little boys need to get some of the oomph out of their to be able to handle things. So there's ways to handle that without going to medications. And so, running laps, we have, there are times when we have our little boys, they get too rambunctious and they need to get some energy out, and instead of punishing them by having them sit in a corner someplace, we have them go run laps, and they come back in and attitude change, and they're tired, and they got their wiggles out, and so it's kind of a cool thing. And so I think a lot of things are off in our culture in the first place. Okay, so having said all that, if you're taking antidepressants, do not stop taking them, because if you didn't have a chemical imbalance before you started taking them, you do now. And if you stop taking them, bad things are going to happen. And so you have to get off of meds with a doctor's supervision. It has to be done over a period of time. I had one friend of mine that had been taking antidepressants for about 8 years. Took her a year to get off of them, a year. And so it's not something that you just stop, because it will mess you up. That's where you get suicides and that kind of thing many times. And so you have to really watch out for this stuff. And as far as dealing with especially little boys of elementary school age and beyond, there are some things that need to be looked at. And one of the things is discipline in the home. Is the little boy being disciplined? And so a little kid left to himself is going to go crazy.
Yep.
They start out little barbarians. They're little people who want what they want. They want it now, and they'll take it if you don't give it to them. And so that's why in toddler classes we have to watch out for them, because one toddler will walk up, smack another toddler, and take the toy away. If that behavior isn't changed at 2 and 3 years old, if it continues when they're in first and second and third grade, what you have is a kid who's out of control, and sometimes these kids are put on ADHD drugs instead of dealing with discipline. And so, again, we could talk about this forever, but I think that we have a culture that's pretty messed up in a lot of areas, because we bag the discipline, we bag the self-control, and we use a pill instead. And I don't think that's something that we necessarily want to be doing to our children. It can cause them some consequences later in life. And so before I ever gave my kid drugs, I would not be taking it from the advice of a teacher. Teachers are not doctors. I would never give my child a drug because a teacher told me to. And if I took them to a doctor and a doctor was trying to convince me of that, I would have a list of questions, and I would not want to know what his credentials are and why he does this and how often he just passes out these meds. And there'd be I'd be real careful about that before I ever did that.
Right.
With my kid. And again, we don't have a crisis with ADHD that just took place in the last generation.
Right.
People have been people for a very long time, and they have acted rambunctiously for a very long time. And there have been ways that it's been handled without having to pass out drugs to a kid. And so I just keep that in mind. Once you get into that, again, you're kind of in a system. Once you start going that direction, and you have to be careful about what you do with your kids in moving away from that. And so again, doctors need to be involved and that kind of thing. That's why if I was ever in a situation where I was looking at my boy or looking at my girl and thinking that maybe there was something wrong, I would be looking at that issue very carefully before I ever got into it. Part of that's experience on my part, in the sense of watching parents who've gotten into those into the system in that kind of sense, whether it's a mental health system or this whole thing with doctor prescribed ADHD medications and that kind of stuff. With somebody in your home who has mental health issues, obviously I sound anti-drug, and I am for the most part, but I have known people over the years who have had problems and who needed medications to be able to function. I had a good friend of mine down in California who came to my Bible study, who'd fried his brain on drugs, and he could not function without meds. And he was a really interesting character. I would do Bible studies with this guy, and in a large group, and he always weirded people out because I'm sitting there talking about the Bible study, and he would ask a question just out of left field as far as everybody else was concerned. And I knew enough about the guy that I knew something about how he processed things. And what he was doing was asking me a question that was 5 to 10 minutes late. Mm-hmm. He's processing something that I said 5 to 10 minutes ago, and he has a question about that. And it was one of those things that would really weird everybody out in the Bible study because he would ask the question, and I just answer it, and and then move on. And everybody else was like, "Where did he even get the question? How'd you get the answer?" and stuff like that. Well, I'm thinking like he thinks. And a lot of people who act weird in situations have reasons for it. They've got some good reasons. And so if all of a sudden I'm just doing this, looking up, that kind of, obviously I'm reacting rationally as far as what I'm seeing. I may not be seeing anything, but what I'm trying to do is bat something away, and I'm freaking out. I'm having some kind of a hallucination. And so what I'm doing is rational in the context of where my head's at. And the issue is finding out why my head's there. Mm-hmm. and what's happening with that whole thing. And many times people can be talked back into reality instead of drugged back into reality. And
so on that note, to just summarize that point, I worked at Benton County Jail for 8.5 years. So the mental health thing has gotten so crazy that they're actually building a mental health wing onto the jail, first in the state. I don't know where they're at with that because when I left, but it's such a big issue that they're trying to wrap funding around the issue. Right. So I've seen a lot of people that need mental health meds, and 95+% of them are dudes that fried their brain on meth,
right?
And they need meds. But one of the examples that's used, I've heard you use it before, is like if you have a problem, if your check engine light comes on, it says you have a problem, you can do a couple things. You can diagnose the engine and fix a problem, or you can reach around and unplug the light.
Right.
It's gonna send the check engine light off, but your motor's gonna blow up.
Right.
to me, a lot of people are, instead of going to the problem of parenting, becoming a Christian, whatever the morality or issue of sin in your life is, instead of dealing with that, they don't know what to do, and they shortcut, unplug the light, and just go on ADD meds.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's always stuck with me as a young believer when I heard a pastor say this is that psychology, because they don't believe in the Lord or Christianity or anything else, their only response to those things are something that removes the power of the Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
So they can control your mind and all that stuff as far as drugs, but they have no remedy for sin, which removes the whole spiritual aspect of it, which is normally the problem.
Yeah. It's like a lot of people feel really bad because they feel guilty, and they have every reason to feel guilty.
Right.
And so they respond to it. And that's what's going on in people's lives. People are selfish. People feel guilty. People do rotten things and then reap the consequences of it. And, you go through a life that's like that, and pretty soon you're going to be a messed up unit. And you're not going to be able to live with yourself. And so the answer is not necessarily giving somebody a drug. The answer is getting forgiven and turning around and having your life changed. And so, again, when I'm looking at somebody who is mentally ill, what I'm looking at is, why are they here? What are they responding to? What are they reacting to? Is there something going on? Sometimes mental illness, as far as how it's diagnosed, is not mental illness at all. It's physical illness. So like you're talking about, having your brain fried on meth, you got some problems in your brain. That's real mental illness.
Yeah.
But other people are dealing with emotional issues and guilt and grief and those kinds of things. And, a drug can calm them down. A drug can dull them up, but it's not going to fix the issue. And so that's what really needs to happen. If I had somebody in my home that was dealing with mental health problems, I would be, obviously there's a whole bunch of things that go along with this. And so I would, the things that I go through with when I'm dealing with somebody who is exhibiting bizarre behavior, is first thing is I get a physical. Sometimes bizarre behavior is because their hormones are off. Sometimes bizarre behavior happens because they literally have a disease, and it comes from those things. And so, getting a physical, making sure that they're okay physically, is one of the issues. Everybody who's ever exhibited bizarre behavior around me, outside of somebody who's been involved with the mental health field, everybody who has ever exhibited bizarre behavior with me has been on drugs. Every single person. Everybody who's flipped out on in any way, it's been drugs. And so those are things that that obviously I look at. And then, if it's not physical, then it's going to be emotional. And if it's emotional, there's usually good reason for fear. But people have good reason to feel guilty, and people have good reason to feel depressed, and they have good reason to feel rotten about their lives. They have good reasons. And so the answer is not necessarily taking away the feelings. The answer is dealing with the reasons. And so that's where I would go to long before I ever went to medications. Except for if I'm worried about whether or not they're going to take their lives. And drugs are always better than suicide. Mm-hmm. So. Yeah.
Do you think that psychology lady that you referenced earlier in the discussion is the psychologists are looking and seeing now, because we're far enough along in the medication thing? I can't remember the date that you used, but at least back to the 90s, 80s, mm-hmm. 90s. We're far enough along to realize that, hey, these meds aren't really working because they're not producing the right behavior, and they're starting to look at that going, what are we doing wrong?
Well, yeah, that's exactly what she's doing.
Right.
She runs specifically a clinic that deals with schizophrenia, and so she's dealing with schizophrenics. The people who are doing this all the time. And what she's noticing is that the drugs are being passed out like they're the cure.
Right.
And the point that she's making is they're not a cure. They can help people to be able to cope if they need something to be able to cope, but they're not fixing a chemical imbalance. They're calming people down, or they're pepping them up, and that's all that they're doing, and that's the point that she's making. And so she's not saying that we need to stop using those things, but basically the way that they're being presented is that you have a chemical imbalance. This is the pill that fixes that particular chemical imbalance, and so you need to take this, instead of giving a patient an option saying, well, this may help you to be able to deal with these issues in your life, and it is a drug, and it is going to make you feel this way. And then when they don't like the drug, come back and say, well, okay, that drug's not working. Well, here's another one that's a little bit more mild, and maybe this will help you get through this period of time in your life, and that kind of thing. And then telling them that they don't need to have it for the rest of their lives. They need to go fix their problems. And she said, if people would do, if you come up to me and tell me that, this is, it's kind of like using an antidepressant like it's penicillin, or like it's amoxicillin,
right?
Saying, well, this is an antibiotic. It will get rid of the disease that you have, and you will feel better afterwards. Well, that's not what those drugs do. Mm-hmm. And so you can't put them on the same level as something that's an actual cure to a problem. And so aspirin, for example, may make me feel better, and it does certain things to my body. But if I have a tumor, it's not going to cure it,
right?
And we could go all kinds of directions with that, but that's really the point that she's making. And so she says that drugs can still be useful, but people need to know that there's a wide range of these kind of drugs, and it doesn't, it's not a one pill cure all type of situation. We need to be rational about the way that we're using these things. And I really loved her approach. I thought it was rational. I thought it was fact-based, and I think it's scientific. So,
do you think, this is the last question I got for on this, do you think that the explosion in anxiety, people not being able to control themselves, is related to the meds that got passed out, or do you think it's more of a place in our culture and morality in society, that because I've seen panic attacks, I know when people, I can identify an anxiety attack just because of my experience working, again, mm-hmm. in the county jail. I understand all those things and what happens when people do that. But now you see even younger kids in school and high school and stuff where I've literally seen people just freak out if they don't have their meds, and they're going through an anxiety attack, getting all worked up and stuff, and it seems to be getting more and more popular. Do you think that that's related because of the psychology push, or do you think it's people are having problems controlling themselves for other issues? Because the rise, I guess, is my point.
Yeah, I think that sometimes it depends on the family. It depends on what the influences are. And so if the influence is all drug centered, and by that I mean med centered, like antidepressants and that kind of thing, and they're all wrapped up in that kind of culture, well, obviously there's an influence there. But generally speaking, people are just people, and they do certain things in certain ways, and not everybody's exactly the same. And so there's some people who are more high-strung, and conflict and problems cause them more problems than other people who are more laid back. I mean, we all have our bents.
Sure.
And so the issue is knowing how to handle anxiety, knowing how to handle fear, knowing how to handle anger. It's like I have a bent towards anger in the sense that there are things that can set me off, and that just tick me off, and I'm not as calm as like my wife is. And so she's pretty much keep everything fine and that kind of stuff. We want to make everybody happy and that kind of thing, except when she's dealing with me. She doesn't care about making, she'll get up in my face, but I'm just messing around, but she does. But she's more like that, and I'm more the kind of person, I see a problem, I'm going to go and take care of it. I'm going to go tackle it and make it stop, and that kind of thing. And so I have a bent, and I know that. And so when I'm in a situation where I am going to be put in a stressful period of time because of the people or the attitudes of the people who are around me, I'm on guard because I don't want to just go off on somebody because they made me mad. You know, I'm supposed to be controlling my anger, and so it's something that I watch out for. And then on the other hand, my wife has, she can have a tendency to gloss things over and think that she's making everything fine, but then it's not fine and it comes back and bites her later on. And so she doesn't want to confront a situation, and I want to confront every situation. And so those are two bents, and you have to know what your bent is, and be able to pull back from that whole thing and do the right thing.
So are you saying that we've stopped training that down to the family unit?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like most people aren't even thinking in those kinds of terms. And so my boy is built different than my girl is. And my boy has all kinds of different issues as far as the way that he handles people and the problems that he's dealing with and that kind of thing than my girl does. And so I have to come at those things from a different point of view, and there are, again, totally different issues that are being involved there. And so my boy is not somebody who is all that impressed with being impressive to his friends. So I never have to deal with vanity on his part. Where on the other hand, my girl likes to be liked. And so she, it's one of those things that, I have to talk with her about. You don't need to constantly be being impressive to all your friends to get somebody to like you. And so, it's just going through life and knowing how to handle things. We have a culture that has just taken family and church away. We have, people are always talking about community. We have no community anymore. And so you don't have anybody that you can talk to. I mean, a lot of us have grown up in families where we frankly don't want to talk to our parents about how to raise our kids because they did such a lousy job with us. And so it's like there are people in my family that I would never have approached on how to raise my kids because they were so messed up. And so we don't have moms, we don't have dads, we don't have grandpas, or we have too many, and they're not even blood relatives anymore.
Right, which is a total mess.
It's just everything's a train wreck. And then a lot of what happens in church, older women teaching the younger women to love their husbands and to take care of their children. It talks about in the book of Titus, and we don't have that. And so it's always good to have an older grandma you go up to and go and say, Grandma, I don't know what to do with my son, and this is what's happening. And she goes, oh, honey, and then starts telling you what you need to do. You need to go out to the tree, get a little switch, and have a little talk with them out behind the shed. And coming from a grandma, it's like it's a different thing than coming from somebody who is 20 years old and going through the same things that you're going through.
Right.
So I think that a lot of times what we're missing is what the Bible talks about as far as family and the community that we live in and things like that. I've seen people talk about their lives, celebrities and actually people who talk about their lives who have had just some horrible thing take place, and they're just lost, and they're lost because they have nobody. There's nobody to talk to. There's nobody to be around. And that's what people need. They need advice from somebody who knows how to raise a family, not from somebody that went to school for 4 years where they told you how to raise a family and they've never raised a family on their own.
Right.
Or if you go in and check their family is a train wreck. And so we don't need something that comes from a textbook out of a college. We need something that comes from an experience where you can look at the person, see how their family turns. These are the people that I go to when I have questions. If I have questions about how to raise my kid, I don't go to somebody who's raised monsters who are in prison. I go to somebody who's raised productive members of society who love the Lord and who walk with Jesus. Those are the people I want to talk to. And so when you're looking at many times some of the books that people get into, they're they don't even know what their families look like. When I do counseling with people, there have been people who've come in to me for marriage counseling and have gone and talked to mental health care professionals, and I'm not saying that they're all bad. I've got some guys who are mental health care professionals that I feel comfortable sending people to, and they'll give them good advice and they'll help them. And so, but there's a lot of guys out there who do not know what they're talking about. And so I've had conversations with people, and I said, so you went to a psychologist for years, and can I ask you what his married life was like? Well, he was on his third marriage. Well, hello.
Yeah. What does he have to tell you?
Yeah, he doesn't have anything to say. He doesn't know how to do a marriage himself. So what's he doing talking to you about yours? And especially, what's he doing contradicting what God says when he talks to you about yours? And so, it's just practical stuff that we need to keep in mind when we're getting counsel from people. Got to watch out for it. So,
okay.
Yeah.
I had another question on PhD qualification. I'll say that for another time.